everyone. I'm Stephanie Bonds, and I'm a postdoc at the Center for Global Development, and I'll be presenting to you on my research on information, student-parent communication, and secondary school choice from Kenya. So we know from a lot of studies that education is really important for both economic and social outcomes, but secondary school dropout rates continue to be high in low-income countries, despite recent gains in primary school completion. Kenya is one example of this. So while primary school completion has increased to 80%, only half of these students will eventually finish secondary school. And I examined this through the lens of information gaps about school characteristics and communication gaps between students and parents during the secondary school choice process. In Kenya, along with many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, students make high-stakes decisions about which secondary schools to apply to, with little information about those school choices and without necessarily communicating with their parents. And a lack of information about these school characteristics can lead students to choose schools that aren't a good match, increasing the likelihood that they'll drop out down the line. So this could be schools that aren't a good fit academically, or schools that are too far from home to commute to every day. And a lack of communication between students and their parents before submitting these applications can worsen these gaps. You can imagine that students might not understand their parents' financial constraints and apply to schools that their parents can't actually afford. And this can also increase the likelihood that they'll drop out down the line. And literature shows that these types of information gaps can particularly disadvantage low SES students. I explore the role of information and communication gaps in this paper by implementing an RCT in Kenya with 3,000 students and their parents. My intervention randomized informational meetings to 8th grade students across 183 schools at the key point where students are applying to secondary school. And in order to examine the added role of the parent in this process, I randomly varied whether or not parents are included in the meeting for a facilitated conversation with their child. The first aspect of this intervention addresses the information gaps, and the second aspect addresses these student-parent communication gaps. And I collect survey data across 3 different points of time on parents and students' knowledge, preferences, and eventual enrollment choices, and then link with administrative records on students' final application choices. And this paper contributes to a branch of literature that examines school choices in both low and high-income country settings. We do have some evidence on targeting information towards parents, but information alone doesn't necessarily have an effect on eventual schooling enrollment. And little is known about the role of student-parent communication in this decision-making process. So I examined this by bringing students and parents together in an informational meeting. So next I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the empirical setting. Probably a lot of you in this room already know this, but Kenya has a centralized school choice system of public government secondary schools. It's still relatively expensive and costs $100 to $500 US per year to attend secondary school. And just to benchmark this, the average income in this sample is about $100 per month. So this is quite substantial. There is a small private school market, but a very few students will eventually attend this. And the secondary school sector is still quite dynamic. The number of secondary schools has nearly doubled in the last decade, and there's still changes in schools such as rural electrification and transportation infrastructure that can change factors such as quality and distance. The transition to secondary school starts at the beginning of 8th grade, and students first submit an application to secondary school by choosing 11 schools out of several hundreds of options that vary in terms of location, cost, and performance. Second, students take an entrance exam, and the score on this exam is used to determine their admission to secondary school. Third, students are assigned to schools, and then they'll eventually decide whether or not to enroll in school and which school to enroll in if they have multiple offers. And there's 2 aspects of this process in which information and communication gaps can affect students' outcomes. So first, at the point at which students select schools, they may not have information on the locations, costs, or performance of these schools. And second, although parents, who are the financial decision maker of the household, will eventually fund the school that the child enrolls in, the students may not have communicated with their parent in advance of submitting this application. Because students have only 11 choices and they can't change these choices after submitting their application, any information gaps in this process are costly. And I'll show you a little bit more about what this process looks like in practice. So students receive a 319-page list of schools, and it just lists the school name and then the category of schools. But importantly, there's no information on the cost of these schools, where these schools are located, so whether it's in their county or another county, or the performance of these schools. And at baseline, we see that there are large information gaps in our baseline survey. So only 40% of parents knew the cost of schools within a $100 range. And secondly, while students have to choose both day schools that they walk to and from every day and boarding schools, 20% of students preferred to go to day schools that were actually too far for them to commute to on a day-to-day basis, defined as more than 7 kilometers each way from home. And then parents are only indirectly informed of school choices to their child. So children look at this list of schools in the classroom, and then they're supposed to discuss these choices with their parents at home, come back to schools ready to submit their final application. But in practice, we find that many students never discuss these choices with their parents. So 1/4 of parents didn't know any of the schools that their child picked, even after the application had been submitted. And this is larger for lower income and lower educated households. So to address these gaps, we designed an intervention in collaboration with the Busia County Department of Education. The intervention has school-level randomization into 3 groups. So the first group is a student-only group, the second is student and parent, and the third group is control. And the study team randomly selected 20 students from each school that were balanced on gender. And both students and parents were surveyed about their preferences in all 3 groups. We can think of the control group as the status quo. So both students and parents are surveyed, and students are given a list of all the secondary school choices that I just showed you, but there's no other information beyond that list. In the treatment group, there's an informational meeting with the class teacher. So again, students and parents are surveyed and given that same list of secondary schools, but they also receive maps with the location of schools, the performance of schools, and the category of schools, both in the county overall, as well as in their specific sub-county that's relevant to them. And then there's a facilitated conversation between meeting participants. And the key difference between these 2 groups is I randomly vary whether or not the parent is present at the meeting. So group 1 is just a student-teacher meeting, and group 2 is a student-teacher-parent meeting, so the parent can participate in this discussion. This shows you what the meeting looks like in the field. So in the first picture, we have a teacher meeting with the student, parent, and enumerator. And in the second picture, you can see the enumerator here that's going through the map with the meeting participants. So everyone receives both a map of all the boarding schools in Busia County, as well as a map of the day schools that they could walk back and forth to in their sub-county that's relevant to them. And the grade 8 school year lasted, it was longer due to COVID. So it was from January 2020 to March 2021. And I conducted the baseline, intervention, and first follow-up survey in the first term, just before schools closed. Then there was a really long gap where schools were closed. So their actual application was due 1 year later than planned. And I'll refer to this again a bit later, but you can see that the application was due here, where I collect the admin data in March of 2021. Then students received their admissions offers in May and started secondary school in August, and that's when I collect the final follow-up survey. So I'll go through 5 main results today. So first, we just want to check whether the intervention worked. So do these informational meetings improve general knowledge about the application process, as well as parents' knowledge about the cost of these different schooling outcomes? So So I'll show you the results for cost here. So you can see in the control group, relative knowledge of cost is low, ranging from around 20% to around 60%. But when the parent attends the meeting, which is group 2, you can see that there's a large and statistically significant increase in their knowledge about the cost of schools. And this is defined as whether or not they can tell us the cost within a $100 range. And the increase ranges from about 20 percentage points to 30 percentage points. And we see larger gains for lower income households. Second, I check whether attending the meeting together between the parent and the child improved alignment of preferences between student and the child. So in addition to eliciting student preferences and parent preferences, I also ask students where they think their parent wants them to attend, and then parents where they think their student wants to attend, and compare this after the meeting. And so in columns 1 and 2, I show knowledge of preferences for the full set of 11 schools on the application. And then in columns 3 and 4, I show it restricted to just the set of Busia County schools, because it might be hard to know knowledge for all schools in the country. By looking at the control mean, you can see that knowledge of each other's preferences is around 30% in the control group, but this increases by 11 to 12 percentage points when the student and parents are in the meeting together. And the increase is larger when restricted to the set of Busia-only schools at 21 percentage points. And then in addition to comparing knowledge of each other's preferences, I also look at alignment of preferences. So students and parents can learn about each other's preferences, but still not necessarily agree on them. And we see in the control group, base alignment of preferences is 25% for all schools and 36% for Busia-only schools. And this increases by 15 to 17 percentage points when students and parents attend the meeting together. So we see that not only do these meetings improve knowledge of choices, but it also increases the alignment between students and parents. And then next, I'll look at the types of schools that these students apply to and try to assess whether they're applying to schools that are a better fit for them based on simple observable characteristics. So we find that attending the meeting leads students to apply to day schools that are closer to home. And for this outcome, it doesn't matter whether or not their parent was in the meeting with them. They apply to closer schools in both groups. And I define this commutability measure in 2 ways. So in the first 3 columns, I look at the proportion of day schools that the student applies to that are within this 7-kilometer radius from home. And then I also just look at the GPS distance between home and secondary school. And you'll see measures for both the student survey preferences, the parent survey preferences, and then the final admin application that was due 1 year later. So in the student preferences in column 1, we see that in the control group, they apply to about 19% of schools that are within this 7-kilometer range. But this increases by 15 to 16 percentage points after attending the meeting in both groups. And then there's still a positive effect for the final administrative data at 8 to 9 percentage points, but it's smaller, probably because it was hard to remember this information for so long, and it's statistically significant for group 1, but not group 2. And important to note is that this increase in applying to schools that are closer didn't come at a cost to the performance of schools. So the average performance of the schools stayed the same. So they were basically able to find schools that were closer at the same level of performance. And then I'll look at students' final enrollment choices as the last measure. So when parents attend the meeting, students eventually enroll in lower cost schools. And this is driven by a shift into the sub-county day school category. So you can see here in the overall sample, students end up enrolling in schools that are $18 cheaper per year, but only significant in group 2. So it seems to matter for financial decisions for their parents to actually be in the meeting with them. And this is larger for lower income households at $29. And then finally, we'll look at conditional on enrolling in a sub-county day school are students enrolling in closer sub-county day schools. And overall, there's no difference in enrollment, but we see that lower income households are enrolling in closer schools, conditional on being in a day school. So overall, we see that these meetings improved knowledge about the application process and schooling costs and led students and parents to align on these preferences. Students applied to closer schools in both treatment groups, and they eventually enrolled in lower cost schools, but only for the parent being in the meeting. And I just want to point out that although $18 is somewhat small, these cost reductions can be meaningful for low SES households. So the average monthly earnings is about $100 per month. And so this is about 17% of monthly household income. And given that households are paying school fees for 4 children on average across 4 years and often have to pay this up front, this can be a significant portion of their income. And I roll out a few different mechanisms. So there's no evidence that students who are in these meetings prepared for secondary school any differently. So they didn't score better on the entrance exam, and they didn't attend primary school more. Treatment students and parents didn't spend any additional time discussing choices outside of the meeting. So it seems that this discussion in the meeting with the teacher was really what led to this alignment of preferences. And then there's no significant evidence that parents of treatment students budgeted for school fees any differently when they attended the meeting. So just to wrap up, so in this paper, my goal is to study whether correcting knowledge gaps through information sharing can lead to better matches between students and schools through an RCT for 8th graders who are transitioning to school. So I find that the meetings improve knowledge and alignment of preferences prior to submitting the final application, and students eventually enroll in lower cost schools. So these informational meetings are pretty low cost and could be potentially scalable. So this might be a good way to just improve choices when students are transitioning from primary to secondary school. And the important next steps are to follow up these students and see what their eventual secondary school exam test scores are, and see whether they drop out of secondary school down the line and what their continuation on to university or the labor market looks like. So I definitely plan to follow up with this sample and collect those measures. So thanks so much. I really look forward to hearing your comments, and you can also feel free to send me an email. And I also want to say thank you to all the enumerators who helped collect this data from Rwanda, Kenya. So thanks so much.
We'll have 5 minutes for a discussion by Laura, or I'll give you the yellow card, I'm sorry, the red card for the 2-minute warning in case you get to it. And then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience.
Hello everyone. To begin, thank you so much for this very good paper, very clear and very beneficial for me. You raise new questions with a strong methodology, and you show that information reaching with children and parents are a low-cost intervention with high impact. You also measure the impact on a lot of interesting outcome, and you also measure the heterogeneous effect. It's not presented here, but in your paper you measure this heterogeneous effect by the sex of children. I'm not expert on LCT, so but I will try to provide some suggestions. First, I think you tried this, but you don't do in this paper. Maybe you could do the regression by clustering standard error at the primary school level. I don't know if it's pertinent, but maybe you can try. Second, your table 1 in appendix where you present the balance of baseline demographics across treatment groups. Maybe it will be pertinent to do the same things with the some outcome variables when you collected at the baseline time. And also, maybe I think you can do this, the same baseline balance of baseline for the characteristic of the primary schools. If you don't collect this information, maybe you can use data collected by the Kenyan Ministry of Education. I know Ivorian Ministry of Education collects on an annual basis this information on all primary schools, secondary schools, with more than 2,000 variables each year. Finally, there are perhaps some possible improvement to better support the reader. For example, by providing a summary table of the variables. For example, you explain how the variables are collected or constructed. Another suggestion to better support the reader is to maybe by explaining as soon as possible in your paper that you are interested by public primary school, because I think I understood very late in the paper and just one dernier suggestion, maybe concerning the heterogeneous impact. I don't know if you collect the sex of the head. Maybe you can look the heterogeneous effect by the sex of the household head, and maybe there are an interaction between the sex of household and the sex of child. I think maybe it's mainly interesting. And finish.
Great.
Thank you.
You're going to respond?
Yeah, so thanks so much for these comments, Laura. This is great. And I can definitely, I'll keep your suggestions. And I do have, so I didn't mention this in the presentation, but I do have the gender of the person who attended the meeting, and they were asked.
Sorry. Maybe we'll have, could you have the microphone for a second? Then we'll have a bring the phone around when you have Q's also. I guess Q's for Steph will have names. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Laura, for your comments. So we asked the student to bring the parent to the meeting who's responsible for making the educational decisions, and I have heterogeneity like that. And it would be interesting to look, although it's not randomly assigned what the gender of the parent is, it would be interesting to look at the complementarities between the child and the parent. So, thank you so much for your comments.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. I have more questions or details about the intervention itself. So can you tell us a bit more about the taker for the parents' intervention? Was it an issue to get the parents to come? And so you just talked about mother or father. So what is the proportion of mother and father you have? And I guess you have a sense of the cost of intervention. You said it's not cost, but how does it compare to the gain for the household?
Yeah, great comment. So it's about 2/3 female in the parent that comes to the meeting. And the final sample is basically students who bring their parent to the meeting because the parent does their consent on the same day that the meeting takes place. And then we just look at the final sample of parents who consented. So this is balanced across groups, and out of the 20 students that are invited to participate, on average we have 17 students that participate. So I would say take up is pretty high, and parents seem to be, they know that this is a really important decision, and they, to the extent they're able to, they're excited to come to this meeting. we learn about the educational choices. So I'd imagine that this were to be implemented as a policy, we would see high interest from parents to come to this meeting. In terms of the cost benefit analysis, this is the next step, so I haven't done this detailed cost versus benefit. I can say that it's pretty low cost and that it's just information. It doesn't matter once you put this initial information together, it's a matter of keeping it updated and distributing it, and the cost of time for connecting these meetings. So we did it on one day with these households, but of course if you did it for everyone, it would take a little bit more time. But that's definitely will be something for it to include for the final paper. Sorry?
The transportation cost was covered by parents.
Yeah, so because the primary school, there's one in every region, people pretty much just walk to the school, so it's not like they were paying to take a bus or anything. Thanks. Should I refer to the or no? Okay.
Maybe you want to
Sure,
share
yeah.
in the house. You'll make you run around.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So very easy part. I think just a follow-up question that whether you also have a the panel that attends the meeting sharing the income. I also see because I'm Kenyan, and I can imagine that it's possible that the primary income in the household is the one that doesn't come to the meeting, but they expect that since cost is actually one that is the outcomes might be different if it's the primary income that comes to the meeting.
Yeah, that's a great point. So they were asked to bring the person that helps them with their school decisions the most, and that might not necessarily be the primary income primary income earner. But we do ask them who decides what school that they're going to attend. And most people, I didn't know the exact number, it seems that it tends to be a joint decision between the mother and father, but I imagine that most of the income earners are the father. But it seems that just because the father is earning the income doesn't mean that they're making the final decision about schooling. But that's a great point. Thank you.
So I'm also really interested in the cost benefit on this because it's got effects and it sounds cheap. I actually think there's like three perspectives you could get there. So one is the fiscal cost of the government, which depending on how you ran this could be zero, right? So if it's like during normal work hours and nobody's paying transportation costs, then for the government doing this, it might cost them nothing. Then there's like the economist version where you work out all the time costs and you can estimate those, and that's people will want to see that. The other one I'm thinking about is like, if this is extra work for the teachers, then you might want to like try to figure out, did they like having these meetings? Was it fun? Was it extending their workday? Is it like changing dissatisfaction? Because, you know, the government can run this at zero cost. They don't need to worry about the time costs per se, but they do need to worry about teachers getting mad, quitting, shirking other tasks, stuff like that.
Yeah, it would be great to do in the follow-up is just kind of get a pulse check from teachers of what they thought about this ex post. Just from doing the meetings and being in the field, they were really excited about these maps. So it's kind of making their job easier. So in Kenya, teachers are moved around quite a bit, so they might not necessarily have this information, but they really want to help students make these choices. They were really excited that the maps and everything were there, that we were coming and doing this. But it's true that like doing it for a long time, it could get annoying to do this with every single student. So I think it would be important if implemented as a policy, you would need to have buy-in from each education department of each sub-county and county that sort of makes this a requirement for teachers to conduct the meeting, so you don't see differences in implementation based on how excited the teacher is of it. But it seems like it's something that helps them do their job better. Thanks for your comments about the cost-benefit analysis as well.
instead of being things. I'm wondering how costly it would be for you to collect some administrative data from schools, like from primary and secondary schools, because I can imagine there's huge developers and applications which you didn't really, I mean, like, eventually I was thinking about
Yeah. So for the primary schools, all of the application data was administrative data that was collected from the schools, and it'd be great to do this at the secondary level, especially if I already with through Williams and Badger looking at kind of spillovers and other student interventions and the performance of students at the schools in general that they attended, and that would be really interesting. So yeah, I'm working on getting some more administrative data, and that would be interesting to look at. Are we for time?
Yeah.
Great. Hello everyone, I'm Laura Martinez, I'm a PhD student at the University of Bordeaux. This paper I present to you today is one of the results of a partnership between Ministry of Education and the School of Economics and French Agency of Development. The first goal for the objectives of the MDG to ensuring primary education to all children in the world was a true success in terms of quantity, but not in quality. In some sub-Saharan African countries, we observe now a bottleneck in the access of secondary education because we observe an increase in the number of children in complex primary schools, and also because of the large demographic growth. Public policy efforts are gradually moving towards secondary education. This figure illustrates this idea. This figure presents the evolution of the number of primary and lower secondary schools in Côte d'Ivoire. On the left, we can see evolution of primary schools, and on the right of secondary school. If we are interested in the ratio of the number of primary school for one middle school, we can observe that this ratio reduces over time. Going from 16 in the 2000 to 9 today. In Côte d'Ivoire, the case study of this paper, the Compulsory Schooling Act is limited because of the access to secondary education in because of two things. First, we observe a weakness of the middle school supply. For example, we can observe 1,000 school-age children per middle school, which is equivalent to 70 students per class. Second, we also observe an unequal spatial distribution of middle schools, like we can see in the figure 2. This unequal distribution of middle school is particularly due to the predominance of private middle schools on the territory, which are constructed in urban area in Abidjan region in majority. In this way, the Ministry of Education recently developed the policy of proximity middle schools. This policy consists to build a small middle school in rural or urban area in place where there are good schools and a lot of demand to form the school. In this way, the true problematic of this paper is to study the impact of middle school construction, also the impact on the short term on educational outcomes, and the long term on employment and labor market. Second, I would like to see how secondary education can improve in the long run well-being of population. There are a large literature on school construction, but here I just try to have an exhaustive imagery on literature existing on secondary school access. First, improving access goes through policy of reducing transport time, for example, through the distribution of bicycles or public transport. Improving access goes through also a policy of secondary schools construction, and through this way, reducing the distance to the secondary school. Here, all the papers cited here shows that a lot of beneficial of access to secondary education on educational outcomes. For example, they show beneficial access to secondary school on primary school enrollment, secondary school enrollment, and also on this. In the long run, I show just one paper which show that the reducing in the distance to the nearest middle school improve the integration in the tertiary sector. The measure of long-term effects, including consistent estimates of return to education using exogenous variation school as instrumental variables, are more difficult to do because it requires, for example, panel data like the Soulay of Quad or pseudo-panel data like Duflo. Also, I see just one paper, the paper of Canero, who estimates using the distance to the nearest middle school as instrumental variable, which measure the impact of secondary schooling on hourly wage is around 30% in Indonesia. Concerning the data I use a set of data. It's a combination of two types of data. First, I use data on middle school, including opening data and geolocation of middle school. I also work on individual employment data, which include information, socioeconomic information, education, and employment data. I also geolocated all individuals in this survey, and I do two restrictions on the sample. I'm focused on individuals aged 25 to 49 years old, and I focus on individuals living in their birthplace, which represents 54 of the sample. Here in this map, you can see the big points are school, and we can see little points in blue, which are working age population geolocated. The first equation that I estimate it's aimed to measure the effect of proximity or distance on educational outcomes. Here, SIGT is a schooling outcome of the individual A born in locality J at the depth T. PNGT is an indicator defined as 1 if there was a middle school within 6 kilometers at the middle school age of the individual A. I also include a set of exogenous variables in the equation, which include sex, ethnic group, region, tutor's education, and also time-varying local characteristics, like birthplace area at the time of the schooling of the individual, and the number of primary school per 1,000 school-age children in the area. I also include a set of fixed effects, science, prefecture, and department 5 years fixed effects, and a robust standard error. I do exactly the same thing, but I not develop because I not report the results today. I do the same thing on labor market outcomes. Here, the second equation I'm interesting. The aim is to evaluate the return to secondary education. It's through a true SLS model. So this equation represents the second stage. Here, the explained variable is the labor market outcome of the individual A. SEGT is the estimate from the first stage equation of years of secondary education beyond primary school. And also, I include the fixed effect and the robust model. This table presents the result of the effect of distance or proximity to secondary schooling on educational outcomes. It's the estimate of the first equation. To make it simple, I propose to interpret only the variable near here. Overall, results show a positive of proximity to school. On the probability to attending primary school, on the probability to obtain this test score, and through this way, access to secondary school improve the capacity to be literate. These results are consistent are in line with the results of Burke and Beagle in Tanzania. Here, I measure the effect of access to secondary school on secondary education outcomes. We can see that one live nearby primary secondary school improve the years of education from improve also attend the probability to attend middle school from 10% and the probability to obtain the UBC from 8%, which is consistent with all the paper which focus on the impact of access to secondary education. I am also interested to the heterogeneous effect of access to secondary school. Concerning the heterogeneous effect, all effects on educational outcome are more important for boys than for girls. Not that I don't find heterogeneous effects on secondary education outcome by area. Table 3 presents the estimate of return to secondary education, where I estimate that one secondary education, additional secondary education, can improve the probability to obtain a formal work by 3% to 4%. And also, improve income by 20 improve income. Sorry. Concerning the heterogeneous return to secondary education, I show that the returns to secondary education are higher in urban area and are higher for girls. My results are strong and reliable effects of physical access to secondary school and primary educational attainment, but these effects are more important for boys. Nevertheless, here are not reported the result, but the beneficial effects on wage are higher for girls. Also, I show that 1 year of post-primary education contributes to 3 to 4 percentage points of a higher chance to have a formal works, and through this improve the wage more for women than for men. Concerning the implication in terms of public policy, location choice of school should reduce the distance traveled for as many children as possible, particularly in remote rural areas. I think it's one of the limits of my paper. I think potentially there are persistence of the indigeneity linked to the location of middle school. One solution is to do after maybe I try estimate with an event student. After this paper, for my PhD, I will evaluate the impact of public middle school construction on the functioning of nearby private middle schools. And also, I would like to evaluate the impact of access to private middle school on student performance with data, with very large data, for example, census on students, on all students in Côte d'Ivoire, and on CSAE, on test score on primary school and test score on middle school for all children in Côte d'Ivoire. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Can I make this question? Yes. Can I time myself? Just trying to not go over. Hey, Maura, thank you so much for writing this paper. It was a pleasure to read. I'll just give a brief overview of some of the things I liked about this paper. First of all, it's important evidence on important question, right? So, this important practical question of how the supply of schools affects educational achievement, I think it's very important to be able to kind of bring new data from new contexts to this kind of question, and you're to be applauded for this. the data exercise, the data gathering exercise you've done is fantastic. I don't think you gave yourself enough credit in the presentation. Like, you really went to so much work to gather kind of various sources to kind of really pinpoint the location of these schools, which is like it's a huge effort and a huge contribution. So that's a super valuable data set that you produced. And as you mentioned, you'll be able to use it for lots of other things, which is cool. So it was cool to see that. It was cool to see that here. I love the decomposition of the relationship that you documented by gender, by urban-rural status, and of course, I'm partial to evidence that access to secondary education affects primary school attainment, as you'll see in the next talk. Okay, so one suggestion I had, and you alluded to this earlier, I would have loved a clearer articulation of what are the assumptions necessary to interpret this relationship as causal. I know that you're an expert on this, like it may be obvious to you, but those of us who are reading your paper, we're brand new, so you got to hold our hands and say, here are the assumptions under which this relationship I'm describing can be called causal. So I thought of a couple challenges to exogeneity here. One is the idea that within any cohort and within any sous-préfecture, we might expect that better educated people are likely to endogenously locate more closely to schools. So as a little example, I thought, what if there's a group of kind of well-educated parents who all live in one part of town, in the rich part of town, or the sous-préfecture, and they all have kids at the same time, and because they're, elite citizens, they demand schools from the government builds those schools, their kids go to the schools, and then their kids do well in school. If I understood right, your model would interpret this as a causal effect when in fact it might be driven by selection. One potential solution that came to my mind is to define distance to school at a coarser level, so that this kind of within sous-préfecture endogeneity of location is less of a problem. If you have the power for it, you may even want to zoom in and use fixed effects at the locality level. I'm not sure if you got power, but if so, I think it would be helpful. Another challenge that came to my mind is, in fact, you alluded to this too, this idea that schools may affect migration. And because your sample is limited to people who still live in the same place they were born, this could lead to some selection bias. A potential, I couldn't think of a solution for this, but at least a test for whether that's going on that may be useful would be to check if whether within cohort you can just test, is it true that people who do or don't live in the same place that they were born, are they equally close to a middle school? If it turns out that those types of people both live equally close to a middle school, then you may worry a little bit less about this source of endogeneity. You may actually find that they don't live equally close to a middle school, which would make us worry more. But either way, it's an important thing to know, I think. Given the assumptions, I think finding some way to give us a sense of parallel trends, just to give us a sense of whether these places with versus without school construction are on a similar trajectory prior to the school construction. If you can do this, that would be nice. Okay. I thought of some other kind of possible ways of defining identification. One is, to kind of go the INPRES route, as you kind of alluded to in your paper, where, I guess the key to this, I think, is kind of defining the geographic region a bit more coarsely than you do to leverage some exogeneity. The trick here is that, Duflo had kind of like this big push in like 1974 when the Indonesian government built all these schools. You don't have that because you just got kind of like the schools trickling in over time. And so it may be tougher to kind of make this exogeneity timing argument. But another thing that you may want to do, I think this may lend itself to a shift share instrument, where you instrument for distance to the nearest school within a geography by interacting a number of schools built in the relevant year with the share of total schools ever built in the country that are represented by that locality or that sous-préfecture. So, you may want to incorporate one or more of these as a robustness check or not, but, it's free disposal. I have, a few other smaller comments, but I'm out of time, so I'll end there and we'll go to Q&A. So, Laura, I don't know if you want to come here in the hot seat, and we'll have a questions around people that have.
So this is just a comment on interpretation. I think on the last slide, you were taking your IB estimates of the effect of attending secondary school at all. And saying, okay, the return to a year of secondary school is X%. If I'm reading your table right, I think you actually have 1.4 years of secondary school from like the IB moving from 0 to 1. And so you would, I'd like to see those three scales so that they're like more in line with like standard labor income. What is the return per year of secondary schooling?
I'm sorry if you can speak more slowly because I have a lot of difficulty in English.
I completely understand. I want to see the return for 1 year of secondary school, which I think is dividing the 24% estimate by 1.4, which is the effect on years. But I'm not 100%. I'm not totally sure that that's the right number. So where you see 24.3, I think there is a divide. I think 24 is the effect of going to secondary school at all, but the effect on years of secondary school is more than 1 year.
24, it's just for women. The estimation just for women. By additional, just for women, when I do the second stage, by adding interaction between sex and secondary education, I show that the 34 is the parameter linked to the parameter linked to just secondary education. I don't know if it's not, no, it's not your question.
Yeah.
I translate very fast, okay? Donc, ce qu'il dit, c'est que 24%, ce que tu mesures, c'est l'impact marginal d'aller à l'éducation primaire. Et donc, c'est pas l'impact d'une année, mais c'est l'impact de 1,4 ans. Parce qu'en fait, ton impact sur l'éducation primaire, c'est 1,4 ans par 1 an. Donc, il faut diviser ça en divisant 24 par 1,4 pour avoir vraiment l'effet d'une année marginale.
D'accord. Thank you.
Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, it's very complicated now.
Yeah, so
I think it's 1.4.
1.4. Because the impact is 1.4 in education. I have the mic, so I will ask you another question. With my French accent. Hopefully to help. Yes, so I want to go back to this 6 kilometers threshold that you're using. So why did you pick 6 kilometers? And did you try your best next year with another one? And I think actually, in terms of policy implication, it would be very interesting to see what happens if you move it to 3, 4, 5, in terms of where does it really make a difference for the households.
First, I choose 6 kilometers because I do just one graphic with parametric, semi-parametric model, and I see that just before there are changements in the relation after 6 kilometers. So I chose this one.
one of the controls and see maybe comment about is the parental years of education, because we think that this is probably the strongest predictor. So as a years of school, it's a really reaching investigation, the child's parents' years of education. And then my second comment to that is really sort of mentioned, but I think it would be important to also look at the students without controlling from, is it like the kids, the responding schools will not reside in the pathways, because I really am quite strongly convinced that you might be shutting down a challenge to which in the school affects like future outcomes, including on like income and all that. So it would be really interesting to see the estimates without like shutting down this about 40%
I'm not sure to understand all. I think you speak about migration, no? Or not?
Okay, maybe it's
Sorry.
so the first comment was on American years of education. You do this in your regulation estimate. You control for this because this is a strong, really strong predictor of the years of schooling for any child. And then the second point was on. So you mentioned that in the street your sample, you only participants who reside at their original place of birth. But I think you might be shutting down and potentially underestimating the effect of this construction, because we think that this is one of the challenges through which, for example, the construction in schools has impacts on the outcomes of your kid. I don't know if that is clear.
It's very complicated. I don't so much understand.
Maybe we can see that as
All right, thanks a lot. Now it's me. Can you hear me in the back if I talk like this? Is it good? Okay. Are you supposed to be on the screen? There's a live stream. That's okay. Right, live stream, I'm back. So, I'm Wayne Sandholtz. I'm going to time myself to try and not talk for a million years. I'm interested in the effect of secondary school access on primary school achievement. Specifically, I'm going to be leveraging a secondary school fee abolition that happened in Tanzania, this free secondary education program. So let me try and get you guys interested, as I am, in this question. Why should we even be interested in this kind of, this kind of, you might call it a kind of dynamic complementarity? One reason that I think it's interesting is kind of a scholarly reason. There's some evidence largely coming from RCTs, kind of well-controlled experiments, suggesting that these kind of merit scholarships at the secondary school level incentivize primary school students to achieve more. There's a really famous Kramer, Miguel, and Thornton paper about this. And so I think free secondary education policies allow us to test, does this type of effect scale, right? A free secondary education policy combined with, entrance exam requirements essentially functions kind of like a scholarship, right? You have to pass the entrance exam, and if you do, then you get free secondary education as if it were, a bursary. So I think testing for this kind of scale is important. There's also a policy reason to try and answer this question. These free secondary education policies are increasingly popular. There's at least 17 countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, that have them. And trying to figure out the costs and benefits is not totally straightforward. These are super expensive policies. They're very controversial. Some people see them as regressive, as kind of subsidizing the rich who are already more likely to go to secondary school. And so, at least in some places, it has been alleged to overcrowd schools and reduce school quality in that sense. So being able to really figure out who all benefits from these policies is an important part of the cost-benefit calculus, I think. So what do we already know in the literature? I'll go through this really fast, but basically we've already seen papers showing that higher level school construction increases the attendance of lower level students who live close by, maybe through a kind of motivation or aspiration channel. We've seen that college scholarships increase high school achievement. There's at least a couple of these papers from Colombia. I'm interested in kind of the next level down of education. And we've also seen a number of papers about these free secondary education policies themselves in different parts of Africa. We've got Ghana, Kenya, and the Gambia here represented. And they tend to work. They help kind of the people that they are intended to help, which is secondary students. So this leaves this question, which is how does free secondary affect primary school achievement, which I hope to answer for you today. So what I'm going to do in this paper, as I mentioned, I'm leveraging this 2016 policy that the government of Tanzania implemented to abolish secondary school fees. And I want to ask how that affected the learning and the achievement of primary school students. First, I'm going to show you some evidence that the policy actually happened, that it was not merely rhetorical, that secondary access did in fact increase as a result of this policy. And then I'm going to try and answer this top question in a causal way. The trick here is that, the policy only happened once in the whole country, so I'm going to have to do a diff and diff by variation in treatment exposure based on how tightly the school fees were binding prior to the policy. I'll talk more about that later, and I'll measure this both at the individual and the ward level. Okay, so let me give you a bit of background on the public education system in Tanzania. Primary school, which is what I'm mostly concerned with here, consists of 7 years. The enrollment, it's pretty high. Net enrollment is 81%, so some room to improve, but reasonably high. Primary school has been free since 2001. There's a Christine Valente paper showing that also led to big increases in enrollment. And at the end of year 7, at the end of primary school, students have to take the primary school leaving examination, PSLE. They have to pass it to advance to secondary school. And this is a binding constraint also. There's a lot of variation year to year, but on average in my sample, the pass rate is 68%. So a lot of kids don't even qualify to go on to secondary school. Okay, secondary school consists of, basic secondary consists of 4 years of school. Net enrollment in secondary is 26%, so way lower than primary. And prior to this policy, there were official fees that were between $10 and $20 per year. And then unofficial fees that schools or head teachers could tack on top of that for books or uniforms or what have you that could be an order of magnitude higher even. So there were kind of a lot of fees. And at the end of year 9, so this is halfway through basic secondary, students take the first national standardized exam of secondary school, which is called the Form 2 National Assessment. Form 2 because they take it after the second year of secondary school. Here are just a bin scatter plot, just kind of mincer returns showing where the returns to education are, at least according to this is non-causal, but take it for what it's worth, which suggests that the wage returns really happen after finishing secondary school. They correspond to 11th grade here is finishing basic secondary, and that's really kind of where you see wage earners start to earn a lot more money, suggesting that finishing secondary school can be really important for students. Okay. So the data I'm going to leverage to try and answer this question comes from the National Examinations Council of Tanzania, which is the government body that administers those national exams I told you about on the last slide. So I have, for a window that brackets the 2016 fee abolition, I have the entire universe of PSLE takers, this primary school exam, and the entire universe of FTNA takers, the first secondary school exam. I show you the histogram of PSLE marks. The passing threshold is at 40%, and so it looks smooth. It doesn't look like there's hanky-panky around the threshold. These are exams that get sent to a central location and graded, so it's not like students' own teachers are grading them. They're blinded, and so I think the grading is reasonably trustable. And one thing that is nice about this data is that it is identifiable by name. I would love it if I had a unique student identifier that allows me to link these exams, but I don't. But I at least have students' names, and 97% of students have a name that is unique in the whole country in their cohort. So it functions as a pretty good identifier. So this matchability on names is going to be important for two reasons in my context. One, it'll give me a proxy measure of transition to secondary school. So I also don't have, just admin data on did this primary school student go on to secondary school, but if I can match them to someone in the secondary school exam data, that'll be my proxy for transition to secondary school. It'll be an undercount because anyone who starts secondary school and drops out before the end of the second year, I won't see. But it's at least some proxy measure of transition to secondary school. The other cool thing I can do is that I can link students into what I will call sibling sets. Tanzania is a place where members of the same family tend to have the same last name. And so by looking at people who share a last name within the same ward, within a pretty small geographic region, I can make some inference about who's related to whom. And that'll be important later as we'll see. Okay, so that's the data. Let me just give a slide of background on this policy I want to study, this free secondary education policy. It was announced in December 2015 at the end of an election campaign after the winner won on the basis of promising this. And it was implemented almost immediately, so there was a really quick turnaround. And in fact, you'll see in the event study graphs that it doesn't seem to have really gotten off the ground until the following year, but at least it was officially implemented in January 2016. And it consists of free education through year 11, that is through basic secondary, those 4 years of basic secondary school. And in order to try and pay for this, to try and pay for the lost school fees, education budget was increased by 22%, $375 million. And most of this increase was paid out as capitation grants per student and sent directly to schools. So like part of the idea behind this law was to bypass the middleman, bypass district and regional education officers, and to send money directly to the schools where it can be used by head teachers to educate students. It was really, at least the rhetoric around this was that it was really supposed to kind of replace all school fees. So like the president gave a big angry speech where he said like, I'll be upset if I hear about any head teachers charging for books or uniforms or any of that. This is fee-free secondary school. So in order to try and figure out whether people understood this to actually be a policy that would be implemented, this is not data from mine, but I looked at a household survey run by Kaweza, an NGO in Tanzania, where they asked a representative sample of Tanzanians around the time of the implementation of this policy, do you expect that this policy will be implemented as promised? And almost everyone said yes. And so at least this suggests that, people expected it to work and people were kind of planning on it being implemented as promised. Okay, so let me try and convince you that the policy actually was implemented in some form similar to what was promised. First of all, just some descriptives. Secondary enrollment rose as proxied by the number of students sitting that FTNA secondary school exam. This was true in poor wards, it was true in rich wards. A lot more students started taking the secondary school exam, suggesting that they were in secondary school. The number of secondary schools also increased. There doesn't seem to have been any particularly sharp increase at the announcement of the policy, but with a couple-year lag, it seems like kind of the pace of school creation, there was an uptick there, suggesting that supply responded, at least in an aggregate sense. Okay, here I think is the most important descriptive evidence that the policy increased access, which is that the relationship between scoring well on the primary school exam and going to secondary school got much stronger. You can see that in the years prior to the policy, 2013, 2014, 2015, even people who got an A, like the top score on the primary school exam, were only about 40 or 50% likely to show up in the secondary school exam. And after the policy was implemented in 2016, this went all the way almost to 100%. So passing the exam became a much better predictor of going to secondary school. suggests that it was alleviating some constraints that were there before. Okay, finally, I want to show you what I think is the coolest evidence that the policy really did increase access, which is it decreased elite advantage. Now, what do I mean by that? One way that I can measure who's an elite is by looking at who has a last name that is the same as a local political candidate. 2015 had elections across the country, including for kind of local council persons. And I was using that data for another project, and I thought, this could be useful. So I matched students' last names to the names of candidates running for local council person in their same ward. And I defined those students as elite students. There's not many of them. It's like less than 1% of the entire sample. But there's some interesting things about it. One, prior to the reform, well, prior and after the reform, the elite students are not as good of students. They're like about 2 or 3 percentage points less likely to pass the exam than the average. Prior to the reform, despite being worse students, they were actually more likely to transition to secondary school, conditional on their primary school exam score. And after the reform was implemented, that difference disappeared completely. So, whatever advantage that these connected people had disappeared after, kind of the democratization of secondary school, if we want to call it that. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that there's at least a reasonable likelihood that this policy increased access to secondary school. Now, let's get down to brass tacks, trying to figure out, did that increased access of secondary school actually affect how primary school students achieved? So, identifying the causal effect of this, again, is tricky because it was a simultaneous nationwide policy. There's no randomization here. There's no staggered rollout. And so what I have to do is decide which primary school students are treated and who do I compare them against. Now, my measure of treatment exposure is going to be financially distressed families. I'm going to say if you're from a family that is poor or financially distressed, unable to pay school fees, you're the target population for this school fee abolition. Now, I lucked out in being able to measure which families are financially distressed because for exactly 1 year, the government, I believe accidentally, posted online this list of 2014 FTNA exam fee non-payers. It looks like this. You can see that some students had their results withheld for failing to pay the fee, okay? And so I only have this for 1 year. But again, because I can link students into likely sibling sets using their last names, I can say, I can try and figure out some proxy for whether you come from a financially distressed family, okay? And again, I'm going to link students by last name within wards. And I'm also going to limit it to not the most, because the most popular name has 3,000 people in it, right? I'm just going to limit it to kind of small groups of kind of not the most common names that actually might be families. So the sample that I'm going to use for analysis consists of primary school students, takers of this PSLE exam, who sat the PSLE between the years 2014 and 2019, and who have a sibling who sat the FTNA in 2014, this important year for which we have the information on exam payments. And this table is just to show you kind of how that analysis sample is different from the overall sample. In many ways, it's similar, right? I mean, it's equally likely to be, the people are equally likely to be girls, equally likely to be public schools because almost all of these primary school takers are public schools. They're a bit higher achieving. They're a bit more likely to pass the PSLE. They're a bit more likely to transition to secondary school, largely because, these are kids from families who've already sent someone to secondary school, right? But, they have equally unique names. And so this analysis sample consists of 3% of the total overall sample. And of those 3%, people who have a sibling from that list, 15% of them are from families where their older sibling failed to pay the exam fee. So that's my treated group. Okay. And by the way, kind of a sanity check on whether kind of this exam fee non-payment really is kind of a measure of socioeconomic status is that prior to the prior to the policy that I studied, these students, these treated students from the poor families were 4 percentage points less likely to pass the PSLE than the control students. that falls to 1.3 percentage points if you residualize by ward, because a lot of this is clustered geographically. Okay, I got a hustle. So it's a pretty straightforward diff and diff, now that I've explained what treatment means in this context. I'm going to show you an event study graph, and then I'm going to show you some tables, but this is plain vanilla diff and diff. I'm including year fixed effects, ward fixed effects. By the way, there's something like 3,000 wards in Tanzania at this time, so it's like a reasonably granular geographic area. Okay, so let's see the results. So here's the event study graph that I think kind of tells the main story, right? That this, the difference between poor students and rich students, poor students and less poor students in this period kind of disappears over the course of, after a couple years after the policy's institution. So these kids from these kids from families who were failing to pay exam fees as of 2014 kind of catch up by 2017 or 2018 in terms of their likelihood of passing the PSLE. Okay. Here's the same thing, the same story being told in a table. So you can see the kind of the effect sizes here, something like 2.7 percentage points treatment effect on these treated students. By the way, you'll see that the kind of, well, first of all, I'll say this also shows up as an increase in the likelihood of transitioning to secondary school. Again, kind of that pre-policy gap is more than overcome in the post-policy period. This doesn't affect the overall PSLE score. So students become more likely to pass, but the average score does not increase at all. And in fact, the likelihood of getting the top grade, an A, comes down a little bit. So when I look at this as kind of a distribution regression, I see that all the action is happening around the threshold, right? That people, the students are much less likely to get 20s and 30s, and more likely to get 40s and 50s. So there's kind of like this shift in the distribution to right over the threshold. This suggests to me, by the way, that this isn't kind of some Ashenfelter dip or mean reversion going on, because it's not like the whole distribution is shifting. It really looks like the action is kind of for these marginal students. Okay. Let me zoom out to the ward level in my last minute or two. You might think that this could be driven by by changes in the composition of students who choose to sit the exam at all. You might think that there might be a mechanism that's being driven by kind of supply side effects on school construction. And so in order to test these, I zoom out to the ward level. And here I'm going to define treatment as, at the ward level as, if there's any student in that ward who failed to pay their exam fees in the year that I looked at, then that's a treated ward. And if there's no schools who failed to pay their exam fees, that's a control ward. There's a fair bit of variation, and again, it's a regular kind of diff and diff. And when I look at this, the results look very similar, actually. So the pass rate, the effect on the pass rate is of a similar magnitude and the same sign. Here we actually do see effects on the overall PSLE score, although it's very small. It's like half a percentage point on a base of 46 points. Transition rate also goes up, but I don't see any significant effect on the number of students sitting the exam or on the number of schools. So this suggests to me that the effects I'm picking up aren't being driven by the changes to the composition of students or by government response. I mean, this also suggests that the government isn't at least immediately responding by building more schools in areas that you might think need them more. So I think it's it may be driven by decisions at the household level. Okay, I'm out of time, but here's my conclusion, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Wayne, for this great paper. It was really a pleasure to read. It's a fantastic paper and very policy relevant. So just to quickly sum up, in this paper, Wayne examined the effect of Tanzania's pre-secondary education policy on primary school learning. And his difference in difference estimation compares financially constrained students with their less financially constrained peers using a really interesting empirical strategy that matches siblings with unique names. and finds that abolishing school fees not only improves the secondary school transition, but also increases primary school exam performance. So a few comments. I think this is excellent and really important that it leverages this large administrative data set to examine these increased secondary school access and learning outcomes. And as Wayne mentioned, it's not clear if secondary school access will actually improve outcomes at the primary school level. And there's some papers that look at scholarship programs and what the effects of that are. But to my knowledge, this is the first paper that looks at this on such a large scale at the national level. And I think the design that matches unique last names with siblings is very creative to examine these counterfactual enrollment differences. And it's actually, like, I found it very convincing. So you might imagine, like, without knowing the context, that it can be hard to match siblings based on last names if there's last names that are really common. But I think he says that 62% of these secondary school exam names are unique within the ward. So I think that's very convincing that this is a good strategy for that. And I also want to mention that this is very important to the policy debate right now in many sub-Saharan African countries that are deciding whether or not to implement this fee-free secondary school. And so I know countries such as Kenya still have fees, but this is a really important contribution to the literature. So I have a few suggestions for potential next steps, and this is mainly possible extensions and not necessarily criticisms of what's already been done. So one thing that I was really interested in as I was reading this is there any heterogeneity by gender? And I don't think you have something on that in the paper currently, but since you have such a large data set, you might be powered to look at differential effects by sibling and younger child. So you can imagine comparing like male-female pairs with male-male pairs and looking at is this effect of having this free secondary education, does it differentially impact female younger siblings versus male younger siblings? I think that would be super interesting to examine. Second, so this is motivated by my own interest in this, but does the reform also lead students to change their application behavior or choices of schools? So you could imagine that when they know that secondary school will be an option for them because the costs are eliminated, students might change their school choice strategies or just become more attentive to their application choices under FSE. And so you could check characteristics also, such as the performance of the schools that these treated students select. So do you see students also selecting into higher quality as proxied by higher performance schools? And so simple dimensions like that you observe in the data. And relatedly, I had a context question. So I know in a lot of contexts you have these day schools that are cheaper and these boarding schools that are more expensive. So I think it would be interesting to just comment on how this free secondary schooling affects boarding versus day. So is everything just free, or do you still have to pay boarding costs? And we might see more students being able to afford boarding schools under FSE, and do we think of these as higher quality schools, and what are the implications for that? So it might be nice just to have a discussion on that, since that's relevant in a lot of these contexts. And then the last comment that I have is it would be interesting to look at longer run outcomes for these students if you can get data on it, such as eventual secondary school completion, things like that. So I'd love to see the follow-up of this. But yeah, thanks so much for this great presentation. I really enjoyed reading this paper.
Okay, well, right on. Thanks, Stephanie, for the comments. I don't have anything to say except these are fantastic comments, and I'll implement them, and I'll love to talk more with you about it. I'd love to hear any other questions you might have or comments.
Hey, this is for my ignorance. I do not know whether teachers in primary schools can disallow certain students to not to take the primary school exam. And I ask that because you should not change the number of students taking the exam. I was wondering whether, because of this policy, primary enrollment may have increased, but didn't show up in the number of students taking the exam because of that type of management.
This is a really nice, and it's an important question. The answer is yes. This is a phenomenon that has been documented as happening. There's a nice paper by Jacobo Cilliers and Isaac Beatty and someone else I'm forgetting at this point, but they do show that there can be gaming of this type going on. So finding a good way to test for that is an important thing that I haven't done yet.
And that might have, incentive for you to find out whether there's an increase in enrollment, like the grade 1 that's not showing up in your number of students taking the exam, you know, when you should.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, this is a nice point. Yeah, because I can get enrollment data for sure. Yeah, thanks.
Since we're here, thanks for the presentation. I think it was a great paper, but also great way to convey. It's very inspiring. You spent a lot of time trying to convince us that something really happened. One thing is, okay, I think I believe you, but still we're talking just about those $10 of official fees and not the unofficial fees of $100. It's hard to believe that schools could make away with those $100 of unofficial fees, especially given that the government only will give them $5 per student to cover for the loss of the $10 that they have. So maybe you want to spend a bit more time discussing that. I don't think you have to conclude that somehow these unofficial fees didn't happen anymore for your study to be valid. I think it already matters that the $10 are gone, right? It's just that maybe the effect will be much bigger if now suddenly the policy is really covering all the costs, including unofficial ones. Secondly, official fees allow you to, for instance, expel students or ask them to stop from going to school, whereas unofficial ones probably don't have that, so you might not buy a book, but the school can't really kick you out. Right? So that's another argument for saying, well, the most important, the most consequential fee is definitely worth. So that's my first thought. The second thing is, you convinced me that the students, the elite students, are less frequently now in schools after reform. Then you have financially struggling families, for example, how prevalent is the presence of a surname for competition among those struggling families? It would be because we spent so much time convincing us that the school fees actually dropped. It would be nice also to see that these elites, and if they are elites, that they're less likely to be present on the list that we observe.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's something I should check. Yeah, on your point on how the math doesn't really add up policy-wise, I need a better answer on this too. I mean, my sense is that there's some idea that a lot of the unofficial fees that were being charged before, and even some of the official fees were kind of were leakage, really, that were kind of inefficiencies that the government was trying to correct. And so the government has some idea that by funding schools directly, that they can do it more cheaply than it was being done before. But I should, anyway, I want to look and see if I can kind of get evidence of, because the admin data I have says nothing about unofficial fees being paid, right? So I need to look around and see if I can find that household survey data that asks about this. It's a nice point to make.
Yes. Do you have any evidence on whether the content or the difficulty of these two national exams to study change as a governmental response, maybe more less math and more something else to try to regulate the number of kids that pass the exam?
It's a good question. It seems to be the case that the exam is becoming easier. The pass rates are going up over this period. And so, I really rely on this kind of within ward variation, to be able to say the exam seems to be getting easier for everyone, but the fact that I'm finding that poor kids are kind of catching up to the rich kids even even considering that.
Change like this math and the cookies are very bad at mathematics, not that you or researcher or something else.
This is a good point. I should look, because I have these exams, and something that's been on my to-do list for a long time is like, pay people to like do these exams to get like a really good measure of like how easy or hard they are, and so like qualifying or codifying them in the way that you would describe it, I think is a nice idea. And so that's a question.
Thank you so much, that was really great. From a policy perspective, you started saying there is no debate on whether there should be or there shouldn't be free secondary school. So are you telling us that this is the way forward?
I think on the margin, I would say that this evidence pushes us in the direction of being more likely to favor free secondary education. I think that's our position.
So you got really cool data, and one question I have about this is, how manipulable and manipulated the scores are by whoever's marking them. In a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, this process is pretty regimented and locked down, but you can still imagine certain kinds of communication. So, thinking mostly about the elites, I'm wondering if you see keeping of the scores just over the pass margin, like bunching, and keeping in multiples of 5, both of which would, to me, imply some kind of fudging by the grader. And conceivably, maybe for the poor kids too, although I doubt that the graders would know. It depends if the teachers are involved in grading.
Yeah, that's a nice point. I mean, what little I've done already to look at this is, I guess I showed you the histogram. It doesn't look too bumpy. I do get the scores with a bit of coarseness. So I get letter grades for each of the individual subjects that I have to aggregate. But I know if you're in the 80 to 90 range. I don't know if you got 87 or 86. Anyway, but I need to.
Is there a unique an average score across all of them to pass?
Yeah.
So then the fudging would be that they nudge one letter grade up by 1 unit just to get the president's kid or whatever into high school.
Yeah. No, the heaping and passing threshold I can look at for sure.
Yeah.
And I don't see it in the overall distribution, but it would be interesting to see if there for you. That's a definite.
Yes, I was wondering whether you ever tried shaping your data with some spatially explicit targeting maps. I know that judgments are working on stuff for the last couple of years, really try to be targeted in a very fine manner. And I think that will help you in setting yourself. I think all of what you have now is within the data, and if setting some holes across the different
Yeah, no, it's a really nice point, Esther. I think one of the things that I think is cool about it is being able to identify individual level variation, because the papers that look at free primary education and to the extent that they look at free secondary education tend to do with the geographic variation. But you're right. At the end of the day, being able to back that up with something else that says, this my kind of roundabout measure of poverty actually correlates with something that people believe. Would be nice. That suggestion. Thank you. Okay. Well, I guess since I'm also the chair, it's also my job to say thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for your